The wind tearing across the Solway Firth in the mid-18th century did not just carry the scent of salt, it carried the heavy, industrial promise of the world beyond the jagged coast of Scotland. For the young John Paul, born on July 6, 1747, in a modest stone cottage on the estate of Arbigland in the stewardship of Kirkcudbright, the horizon was not a limit but a relentless invitation. He was the son of a gardener, a profession rooted in the earth, bound by the seasons, the soil, and the rigid social stratification of the Scottish lowlands. But John Paul was bound by nothing but the tide. At the age of 12, when most boys of his station were learning the spade or the plough, he apprenticed himself to a merchant in Whitehaven, the bustling English port just across the Firth. It was the first severance of his roots, a deliberate unmooring that would define his entire existence. Whitehaven in the mid-18th century was a cauldron of maritime commerce, a place where the air was thick with coal dust and the jargon of sailors. It was the third busiest port in the kingdom, a hub where the raw resources of the Americas met the industrial hunger of Britain. Here, the boy became a part of the British Merchant Marine, an institution that powered the empire. He was small, wiry, and possessed of a vanity that seemed incongruous with his station, yet his aptitude for the sea was absolute. He learned the geometry of the rigging and the calculus of the currents with a speed that startled his superiors. By 19, he was the first mate of a slaver, the brigantine Two Friends. It is here, in the dark belly of the Atlantic trade, that the first fractures in his character appeared. The slave trade was the engine of the colonial economy, a brutal, efficient machine of human misery. John Paul excelled at navigation, discipline, and the sheer logistics of the voyage, yet he grew to loathe the abominable trade. It was a moral dissonance that he could not reconcile, a friction between his ambition and his conscience. In 1768, he abandoned his position in Jamaica, disgusted, and booked passage back to Scotland on the brig John. Fate, however, is rarely idle with men of such volatility. En route, both the captain and the ranking mate of the John died of yellow fever. The crew, leaderless and terrified in the vast indifference of the ocean, looked to the passenger who knew the stars. John Paul took the helm. He navigated the ship safely back to the port of Kirkcudbright, a feat of seamanship that earned him the gratitude of the owners, Curry, Beck and Cauders, who promptly appointed him master of the vessel. He was 21 years old, a captain, and a son of the stewardship made good. But the sea gives nothing without exacting a price. On his second voyage to the West Indies in 1770, the discipline that defined his command curdled into perceived cruelty. The ship's carpenter, Mungo Maxwell, a man of local prominence in Kirkcudbright, was accused of negligence. In the unforgiving hierarchy of a ship at sea, negligence was not merely a professional failing, it was a mortal threat to the vessel and every soul aboard. Captain Paul ordered Maxwell flogged. The cat-o'-nine-tails was the instrument of justice, a brutal whip that flayed the skin and broke the spirit. Maxwell took the lashes, his back a ruin of welts and blood. When the John docked in Tobago, Maxwell lodged a complaint with the Vice Admiralty Court. The judge, seeing the scars but perhaps indifferent to the suffering of a sailor in a harsh age, dismissed the complaint as frivolous. Maxwell, broken and embittered, booked passage home on the Barcelona packet. He never saw Scotland again. He died of fever at sea, but the news that reached Kirkcudbright was not of fever, but of murder. His father, a man of influence, claimed his son had died from the wounds inflicted by John Paul's whip. John Paul returned to Scotland not as a hero, but as a pariah. The community that had celebrated his rise now whispered of his brutality. He was arrested, imprisoned in the grim Tolbooth of Kirkcudbright, and charged with murder. The walls of the cell were cold, damp, and silent, a stark contrast to the freedom of the quarterdeck. He secured bail, and eventually the evidence, declarations from Tobago and the master of the Barcelona packet, proved that Maxwell had been in perfect health when he boarded the packet boat. John Paul was acquitted, but the stain remained. In the eyes of his countrymen, he was a hard man, a flogger, a killer of his own. He left Scotland again, this time commanding the Betsy of London. He was running from a reputation he felt was unearned, sailing toward a fortune he was desperate to secure. He engaged in commercial speculation in the islands, trading in the goods of the empire, trying to build a wealth that would insulate him from the whispers of Kirkcud Bright. But the temper that had scarred Mungo Maxwell was still there, coiled and waiting. He was a man who demanded perfection in a world of ragged edges, a captain who saw insubordination not just as a threat to the ship, but as a personal insult. By 1773, he was in Tobago again. The air was heavy, the heat oppressive, and the crew of the Betsy was restless. They were men of the lower decks, hard-bitten and cynical, and they sensed the fragility of their captain's authority. They wanted their wages. He wanted order. The tension on the Betsy was a physical weight, a static charge building before the lightning strike. John Paul paced the quarterdeck, his hand never far from the hilt of his sword, unaware that the next moment would sever him from his name, his past, and his country forever. The harbor of Tobago was a suffocating blanket of humid night air, broken only by the creak of timber and the distant rhythmic lap of water against the hull. It was late in 1773, and the Betsy sat heavy at anchor, a wooden island of tension in the tropical dark. Captain John Paul stood on the quarterdeck, the sweat trickling down his spine not solely from the heat, but from a coiled, predatory vigilance. The financial strain of the voyage had been immense. He had invested heavily in the cargo, hoping to clear his name with gold if not with exoneration, but the liquidity was not there to pay the men immediately. Below decks, the murmurs had grown into a growl. The crew had not been paid for months. The air in the forecastle was thick with the sour smell of unwashed bodies and the sharper tang of rebellion. The ringleader, a massive, brooding man whose name history would often obscure, sometimes called Jack, sometimes simply the mutineer, had spent the evening stoking the fires of grievance. He was a local of the islands, powerful and unintimidated by the small, intense Scotsman who commanded them. John Paul could hear the heavy thud of boots on the ladder. It was the sound of authority being challenged, the sound of a contract breaking. He turned, his hand instinctively finding the pommel of his small sword. The ringleader emerged onto the deck, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. He was not alone. The shadows behind him were filled with the sullen eyes of men who had decided that the law of the sea no longer applied. "We want our money, Paul," the ringleader growled, stepping forward. There was no captain, no sir. The insubordination hung in the air like smoke. The man's physical presence was a threat in itself, a mountain of muscle against the captain's slight frame. "You will receive your wages when the cargo is sold and the accounts are settled," John Paul replied, his voice tight, clipped, and dangerous. "Return to your stations." The ringleader laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. He held a bludgeon, a heavy belaying pin, or perhaps a length of wood scavenged from the hold. He advanced, invading the sacred distance between captain and crew. "We are done waiting. We are taking what is ours." John Paul drew his sword. The steel hissed as it left the scabbard, a thin line of silver in the gloom. "Stand back," he warned. "This is mutiny. The penalty is death." The man did not stop. He lunged, the bludgeon swinging in a vicious arc meant to crush bone. John Paul, trained in the fencing salons as well as the rough brawls of the port, stepped back. He parried, the wood clattering against his steel. But the man was relentless, driven by a fury that had moved beyond reason. He swung again, driving the captain back toward the cabin hatch. Cornered, with the dark water behind him and the mutineer's weapon raised for a killing blow, John Paul reacted with the instinct of a survivor. He did not slash, he thrust. He stepped forward, locking his arm, and the point of his sword met the onrushing weight of the mutineer. The man who eventually rode into the Virginia countryside in 1774 was a ghost. He had no ship, no commission, and, for all legal purposes, no name. The John Paul of Kirkcudbright and Tobago had ceased to exist, vanishing into the fugitive ether to escape the British Admiralty courts. In his place emerged John Jones, a man of quiet demeanor and obscure antecedents, who eventually settled in Fredericksburg at the home of his brother, William Paul, a tailor who had died shortly before John's arrival. Virginia in 1774 was not merely a colony, it was a tinderbox. The air was electric with the rhetoric of Patrick Henry and the quiet, steely resolve of Thomas Jefferson. For Jones, a man whose life had been defined by the rigid, often brutal hierarchies of the British class system and the Royal Navy's dominance, the language of revolution was intoxicating. It offered him something he had never possessed, a path to redemption through merit. In the rigid stratification of Britain, he was a gardener's son and a fugitive. In America, he could be a gentleman and a warrior. The patronage of men like Willie Jones of North Carolina, though the extent of their relationship remains debated by historians, likely provided the social cover he needed to reintegrate into society. When the shots rang out at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the ghost materialized. Jones traveled to Philadelphia, the nerve center of the rebellion, to offer his sword to the Continental Congress. He was not just a volunteer, he was a professional mariner in a land of farmers and militia. He possessed a technical knowledge of the sea that few of the political captains of the new Continental Navy could match. With the patronage of influential members of Congress like Joseph Hughes of North Carolina, he was commissioned as a senior lieutenant on the Alfred, the flagship of the tiny American fleet. It was on the Alfred's quarterdeck, on a crisp December day in 1775, that Jones claimed to have hoisted the Grand Union flag, the first time the American colors were raised over a naval vessel. It was a symbolic act that fused his personal ambition with the national cause. He was no longer running, he was leading. His early service displayed the aggressive, calculating tactical genius that would define his legend. Given command of the sloop Providence in 1776, he did not merely patrol, he hunted. He raided the British fisheries in Nova Scotia, burning vessels and seizing prizes with an audacity that stunned the Royal Navy. He captured 16 ships in a single cruise, a feat of economic warfare that brought vital supplies to the struggling Continental Army. But Jones was not satisfied with seizing merchant sloops in the colonies. He understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, the strategic asymmetry of the war. America could not defeat the Royal Navy ship for ship. The disparity in firepower was laughable. Instead, America had to strike at the psychological and economic heart of the enemy. The war had to be brought to the doorsteps of the Englishmen who viewed the conflict as a distant colonial squabble. In 1777, he was given command of the Ranger, a new sloop of war built in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was a fast, sleek vessel, perfectly suited for his vision. He sailed for France carrying the news of the victory at Saratoga, the turning point that would bring the French into the war. In France, he was feted, not just as a captain, but as a symbol of the noble savage republicanism that fascinated the French court. He met Benjamin Franklin, who recognized in the fiery Scot a kindred spirit of innovation and defiance. On February 14, 1778, in Quiberon Bay, Jones sailed the Ranger through the French fleet. At his insistence, the French admiral, La Motte Piquet, returned his salute, 9 guns for 13. It was the first official recognition of the American flag by a foreign power. For Jones, the gardener's son who had been hunted for murder, it was a moment of supreme validation. He was now the representative of a sovereign nation, equal in honor to the captains of the king. With this diplomatic victory secured, Jones turned his eyes north, across the Channel. He was going home. Not to Kirkcudbright to stand trial, but to the coasts of England and Scotland to wage war. He intended to burn the shipping in Whitehaven, the very port where he had been apprenticed. He intended to kidnap an earl. He intended to make the insurance rates in London scream. In April 1778, the Rangers slipped into the Irish Sea like a wolf into a sheepfold. This was the Mare Nostrum of the British Empire, a body of water considered so secure that the idea of an enemy warship patrolling it was laughable. Jones intended to turn that laughter into terror. His target was Whitehaven. It was a personal choice. He knew the harbor's tides, its shoals, and its defenses intimately from his boyhood. He knew that hundreds of merchant ships lay grounded there at low tide, vulnerable, packed hull to hull like dry kindling. On the night of April 22nd, Jones led a raiding party of 2 boats into the sleeping harbor. The plan was audacious: spike the guns of the defensive forts and set fire to the merchant fleet. If successful, the conflagration would consume the town and strike a blow to British commerce that would resonate in every counting house in London. They achieved the first objective with silent efficiency, climbing the walls of the southern fort and spiking the cannons, driving metal files into the touch holes to render them useless. But the arson attempts faltered. The lantern they had brought ran out of fuel. Time was wasting as dawn approached. Jones, undeterred, raided a local public house for a light, a surreal moment where the invaders paused for a drink while the town slept on. Disaster struck in the form of treason. One of his crew, an Irishman named David Freeman, slipped away in the darkness. Freeman ran through the streets of Whitehaven, banging on doors and screaming that the Yankees were burning the town. He was a horseless Paul Revere, waking the citizens to save their own ships. The town roused. Residents poured onto the quay, armed with whatever they could find. Jones, standing alone on the pier with a pistol in hand, held back the mob while his men set fire to the collier Thompson. The flames licked up the rigging, but the fire failed to spread to the rest of the fleet before the Rangers' boats had to retreat. As they rowed away, the sullen, terrified glare of the townspeople followed them. Jones had not burned the fleet, but he had incinerated their sense of security. The very next day, Jones crossed the Solway to St. Mary's Isle. His objective was the Earl of Selkirk. He planned to kidnap the Earl and hold him hostage to force the British government to exchange American prisoners, men who were currently rotting in English jails, treated as traitors rather than prisoners of war. Jones landed his boat and marched to the manor house. It was a bizarre home invasion. The Earl was away in London. Jones, disappointed, was ready to return to the ship, but his officers demanded plunder. They were privateers at heart, and they felt entitled to some reward for the risk. To appease them, Jones allowed them to take the family silver, but under strict orders: no violence, no looting of personal items, only the plate. The Countess of Selkirk, pregnant and composed, faced the Americans with dignity. Her butler, Daniel, tried to hide the silver, but she ordered it handed over. The Americans sacked the pantry, taking the teapot that still held the morning's tea. It was a polite robbery, conducted with a strange chivalry that baffled the British press. Jones would later personally purchase the silver back from his crew and return it to the Countess after the war, a gesture that cemented his reputation as a gentleman pirate. The impact of these 2 days was seismic. For the first time in centuries, an enemy had landed on British soil. The Royal Navy, the wooden walls of England, had been breached by a gardener's son in a sloop. The panic was immediate and financial. In London, the underwriters at Lloyd's Coffee House, the nerve center of global marine insurance, went into a frenzy. Insurance rates for shipping in the Irish Sea did not just rise, they skyrocketed. Before Jones, a voyage from Dublin to London was a mundane, low-risk affair. Now it was a voyage through a war zone. Premiums jumped from 1.5% to 5% of the cargo value overnight, a punitive tax on British commerce imposed by one man. The press dubbed him Paul Jones the Pirate. They printed lurid cartoons of him as a swarthy, desperate brigand. But in the counting houses, he was something worse than a pirate. He was a market force. He had demonstrated that the Empire could not protect its own trade. To cap his cruise, Jones engaged the HMS Drake, a fully manned Royal Navy sloop of war, off Carrickfergus. In an hour-long duel, he battered the British ship into submission and captured her. He returned to France not just with a prize, but with the aura of invincibility. He had done what no continental captain had dared. He had humiliated the lion in its own den. France in 1779 was a place of intrigue and delay. Jones, despite his heroics, found himself entangled in the bureaucracy of the French Marine and the jealousies of American commissioners. He spent months begging for a ship, writing endless letters, his ambition chafing against the idleness. Finally, he was granted a vessel, the Duc de Duras, an aging, rotting East India man. She was slow, her timbers were tired, and she sailed like a haystack. Jones renamed her Bonhomme Richard, in honor of his patron Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard. He cobbled together a squadron, the Alliance, a fine American frigate commanded by the unstable and paranoid French captain Pierre Landais, the Pallas, and the Vengeance. It was a mongrel fleet, manned by a motley crew of Portuguese, Maltese, Swedes, and a backbone of American and British sailors. In August 1779, they circled the British Isles, a squadron of disturbance. They captured prizes off Scotland, causing alarm fires to be lit along the coast. But Jones wanted a warship. He wanted a fight that would be remembered. On September 23rd, off Flamborough Head in Yorkshire, he found it. A massive British convoy of 41 merchant ships appeared, carrying vital naval stores from the Baltic. Escorting them was the HMS Serapis, a brand-new copper-bottomed 44-gun frigate, one of the finest ships in the Royal Navy, commanded by Captain Richard Pearson. The Serapis was superior in every metric: speed, firepower, and maneuverability. Jones knew he could not win a gunnery duel. His only chance was to close the distance, to turn a naval battle into a street fight. The sun set, and a full harvest moon rose, illuminating the calm sea. The cliffs of Flamborough Head were lined with spectators, English civilians watching the war unfold like a play. At 7:00 p.m., the battle joined. The Richard's heavy 18-pounder guns, old and brittle, exploded on the first broadside, killing their crews and blowing a hole in the deck. Jones was instantly deprived of his main battery. The Serapis pounded the Richard, raking her with devastating broadsides. The American ship was being reduced to splinters. Her hold was filling with water. Her rudder was damaged. Captain Pearson, seeing the ruin of the American ship, hailed Jones through the smoke. "Has your ship struck?" It was a reasonable question. By all laws of naval warfare, the Bonhomme Richard was beaten. She was sinking and burning. But Jones, standing on the quarterdeck surrounded by the dead and the dying, shouted back the words that would immortalize him. "I have not yet begun to fight." It was madness, but it was a calculated madness. Jones rammed the Serapis, and his men lashed the two ships together. Grappling hooks bit into the enemy rail. The ships ground against each other, muzzle to muzzle. The battle devolved into a savage intimacy. The British guns blew the bottom out of the Richard, but the American Marines in the fighting tops, led by midshipmen, Nathaniel Fanning, rained grenades and musket fire onto the deck of the Serapis. The fight lasted 3.5 hours. The Richard was a burning wreck, kept afloat only by the pumps and the fact that she was tied to the Serapis. The treacherous Captain Landais of the Alliance sailed by and fired broadsides, indiscriminately hitting both the British and his own Commodore. Finally, a grenade thrown by one of Jones's men dropped through a hatch on the Serapis and ignited a pile of cartridges on the gun deck. The explosion was catastrophic, killing dozens of British gunners. Pearson, his mainmast tottering and his men decimated by the sniper fire from the tops, struck his colors. Jones took the Serapis as his prize. The Bonhomme Richard, her duty done, sank into the North Sea the next day, her flag still flying. Jones sailed the battered Serapis into the Texel in the Netherlands. a ghost ship commanded by a revenant. The reaction in London was hysteria. The terror of the English had defeated a Royal Navy frigate in sight of the Yorkshire coast. The insurance rates, already high from the Ranger cruise, spiked again. The London Evening Post, reflecting the mood of the capital, reported that Jones was styled the terror of the English, and that business on the exchange gave way to curiosity and panic. The Paul Jones panic was total. He was no longer just a pirate. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature that had exposed the vulnerability of the greatest naval power on Earth. The applause in Paris was deafening. Jones was presented with a gold-hilted sword by Louis XVI and declared a Chevalier of France. He was the toast of the salons, the hero of the American Republic. But as the adulation washed over him, the timeline of his life folded back upon itself. The glory of 1779 was inextricably bound to the darkness of 1773. We must return to that night in Tobago, to the silence that followed the fall of the mutineer's body. John Paul, the man who would be Jones, mounted the horse and rode into the tropical darkness. He did not know then that he was riding toward Flamborough Head. He did not know that the blood on the deck of the Betsy was the ink in which the Declaration of Independence would, in a strange personal sense, be written for him. He crossed the island to the other coast, a fugitive with his heart hammering against his ribs. He found a vessel departing for America, and he boarded it not as a captain, but as a passenger, a nobody. As the ship slipped away from the dock, leaving the dead man and the accusations behind, John Paul watched the island recede. In that moment of severance, the gardener's son died. The meticulous, ambitious merchant captain who worried about cargo manifests and the approval of the Kirkcudbright elite was gone. In his place was a man with nothing to lose, a man who had killed, who had fled, and who now existed in the margins of the law. The John Paul Jones, who emerged in Virginia, was a construct of necessity. He was harder, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous than John Paul had ever been. The reckless courage he displayed at Whitehaven, the sheer refusal to surrender at Flamborough Head when any sane man would have struck his colors, these were the traits of a man who had already lost his life once. He fought the British Navy not just for America, but because he could never go home. Every broadside he fired into a British hull was a rejection of the society that had labeled him a murderer. He never truly escaped the shadow of Mungo Maxwell and the Tobago mutineer. The rumors dogged him even in his glory. But in the end, the fugitive did not just outrun the law, he outran history. He forced the world to rewrite his name, not in the ledger of a criminal court, but in the annals of legends. He died in Paris in 1792, alone, while the French Revolution raged outside his window, a man who had ignited the oceans and left the insurance men of London trembling in his wake.